It is Wednesday. Welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. It's 1 o'clock. We welcome you, along with Edgar Zazweta, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome back after the holidays. Go ahead and drop us a line. Say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know where your district, what's happening over there in your district today. Edgar, welcome back. How are your holidays?
Good, Naj. Happy New Year. I mean, it was good. It was a little busy last week, as we're going to talk about. Wasn't as quiet, and I know the governor had something to say about all of our members' vacation last week and dropping some news. But hey, we were all waiting for 2021, and we're here, right? So for better, for worse, and let's get after it.
I got a lot of compliments from our attire from the last show before the holidays. A lot of people were commenting that was some of the most outrageous attire that you and I could have come up with. However, I will say the number of people that said they appreciated that you dressed up the holiday sweater with a jacket, because they said, see, now that's professionalism. He's going to go from one end to the other, but he's going to make sure, because we have a lawmaker on the show, he's going to keep it as dressed up as possible.
I don't always wear a jacket, as you can tell on this show, but, we had a member of the legislature, so I figured I needed to dress up the Christmas sweater a little bit.
That's right. Hey, just want to say hello, Michelle, Angela Shull, Gary Reller with us today, Victor, Maria, Joy. So good to have you guys on the show today, and thank you so much for that. We've got a lot to talk about today, from the governor's office, the budget proposal that's coming out. I do want to let you know of two things that we are monitoring right now. We are monitoring, obviously, that Georgia Senate vote, and if we have finality on that, we will certainly pass that along while the show is going on. The other thing that we're monitoring today, and I will try and be as politically savvy as I pass this word along, Edgar, but it's been mayhem in Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Capitol today. As you know, Congress began the process of certifying the Electoral College votes in the 10 o'clock hour this morning. And there was a protest that was going on really throughout the morning outside of the Capitol. Right in that 10 o'clock hour, that's when GOP lawmakers objected to the votes in Arizona. And that's when the protesters, and you can see some video here, that's when the protesters began storming into the U.S. Capitol. The House and the Senate were in separate debates at that time. And as the proceedings were taking place, protesters moved their way inside the Capitol. That forced lockdowns and evacuations of lawmakers. This is video as the lawmakers were being pulled out of the chambers this morning, as protesters were making their way in. Michael Kelly, our executive producer, has a couple of other pieces of video that we're going to show you. There you can see some of the protesters. They actually got into the chambers while this protest was going on. You can see some of the craziness, if you will, outside of the chambers as well. And we do have some additional pictures, and some of them are a little bit disturbing. I'll just editorialize that. Some of them are disturbing. One in particular that I want Michael to pull up, and that is some armed activity. There it is. Some armed activity happening in one of the chambers, guns drawn, as there was the effort to protect lawmakers. There you see more video coming on there. Edgar, I'll bring you on because I'd love to get your comments on this. One thing that came up in the last 30 minutes right before we came up was an observation made by one of the reporters for one of the networks about the time right now is closing in on when the sun sets. And so it's going to get dark over there. Some of the students that have schools near the U.S. Capitol remain on lockdown, and those protesters protesting in darkness certainly adds a little bit to what's going on over there. But Edgar, you've been in all of those places where the protesters are. What are you seeing about all of this taking place?
Yeah, as so many of us, I mean, I have a connection to that city, got to work back there, obviously spent time back there as part of our job. And, we like to have fun on this show and keep it lighthearted. I mean, and I struggled, frankly, the hour leading up to this to just kind of make peace with all of us, and peace being, not the right word right now, but just like, how do we make sense of it? And I don't know if there's other way to say it, but it's sad. It's really sad to see what's happened here, and regardless of our political affiliation, regardless of who we voted for, that this is what it's come to. And similar to what you just talked about, Naj, in terms of just the impact on the kids in that community, my mind quickly went to being a father of two, and my daughter, doing distance learning as we're speaking. It's like, well, how do you even explain this to her, right? How do our members, support their teams, and teachers talking to their students about this? I mean, personally, the reason I'm in this business, I've always been a political government junkie. Since I was a little kid, loved watching the news, kind of what was happening. And I have to say, one of the things that I've always been proud of is, no matter what, when we got a new president, I always thought there was something to be said about this image of, regardless of who won or lost, that the other person leaving office was always there, that you always had that transfer of power. And it's a scary time in our country. I don't know how else to say it. And it's sad. It's sad. I joke at the beginning about, we all wanted 2021 to kind of commence for so many reasons. And I don't know where we go from here, but I can only hope that we turn the corner from some of this.
Yeah, and right before I moved down to our studio for our show, I had an opportunity to talk with my two daughters, who are in the process of distance learning, and they were on a break. And I told them, hey, while you're on your break, while you take lunch, go ahead and turn on one of the news networks and watch this electoral college process that's taking place, because from a historical standpoint, it's always good to, try and jump in and at least see the process taking place. And it was literally minutes later that we started seeing all of this. So I'm with you as far as, the children's situation is concerned. Want to make sure we say hello to some of our viewers out there before we move into our topics today. Alexis and Denise, Kelly, Don Austin over at Palo Alto Unified, Alexis, Therese, our longtime loyal viewer, Scott Smith at ABC Unified. So good to have all of you here as well. Edgar, two things we're going to tackle today. One is what came out last Wednesday, the governor's Safe Schools for All plan. Let me just give you guys a little bit of information on this. This came out again Wednesday. Edgar and I and the whole ACSA team on top of this. The framework had 4 pillars: funding, safety and mitigation, oversight and assistance, transparency and accountability. The governor shared some research about the low risk of COVID-19 transmission among students. And he said getting students back into the classroom, important, especially for younger students, the students with disabilities, those disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And Edgar, I'll have you address the funding piece in just a second, but I also have this, which came from our large urban districts earlier today. It was a letter that was sent to the governor from LA Unified, San Diego Unified, Fresno, Long Beach, Sac City, Oakland, and San Francisco Unified, basically spelling out that this plan, this Safe Schools for All plan, fails to address the needs of the urban school districts that serve nearly a quarter of the state's students, almost all who live below the poverty level. They have several different aspects, several things that they see need to be delivered. Edgar, your initial thoughts, since you and I were hearing about this early last week and where we are now.
Yeah, before I jump into responding to that, I did see that Tracy pointed out that President-elect Biden is speaking. So our apologies for for talking over it. We try to avoid that with the governor. We weren't anticipating that, but we wanted to forge ahead with our program. So thank you for joining us. Yeah, as you mentioned, Naj. So last week that was a big announcement, and what the governor essentially was doing was essentially giving an early preview of what he's going to ultimately announce as part of his budget, probably later this week, which will be a cornerstone. as we've been talking about for months, this whole notion of reopening for, I think, a couple weeks, we had legislative guests. We've heard from Assemblymember Phil Ting and how the legislature was really getting frustrated at maybe the lack of direction that schools were getting from the state, that even when the COVID rates were better, that when schools were eligible, they weren't reopening. And so there had been a lot of pressure, I think it's fair to say, on the governor, on the administration of what role are they going to take? Are they going to be more proactive in trying to get schools to reopen? Now, the question we get right away, what's up with the timing? Why are we talking about this literally in the midst of the worst part of the pandemic that we faced? And the governor, knew that he was going to get posed that question and said that they are really trying to look at what's going to happen later this spring. And by putting out this plan now, they're trying to make sure that schools are able to plan for this. You talked about the pillars, Naj. Let me give a few other highlights. So the part that's probably getting the most attention is that the state is going to try to incentivize LEA school districts to reopen by a couple of deadlines. They're going to put a couple of benchmarks out there, February, March. Depending which one you hit, you will get a certain amount of money. The average amount is $450 per student. That fluctuates depending on your district, your LCFF numbers, so essentially your unduplicated count, low income, foster youth, English learners. So depending what district you're in, that amount would change. You would have to meet these benchmarks by doing a number of things. You have to put a new COVID safety plan together. You have to negotiate that with your employees, which we'll talk about. And you have to meet a number of new guidelines that we're going to get more details on throughout the week. Namely, the biggest one probably is there's new testing cadences that the California Department of Public Health is putting out that essentially, depending on the county that you reside in, right now, because we're all purple, I'll talk about purple. If you're in a purple county, you would have to test every students and staff every 2 weeks. You have to have a plan to test every 2 weeks, students and staff. Now, the flip side of that is we get a lot of questions about waivers. There's not going to be no more elementary school waiver as we saw it. If districts have a COVID rate of less than 28 per 100,000, they can open as long as they hit some of these benchmarks. But it will be presumed to be approved unless you're told otherwise by your county health officer in the state. So a lot in there. We're going to talk a lot about this week. There's various programs. We'll talk about that, but those being the general highlights.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And folks, we want to remind you, questions and comments, go ahead and submit them. We love to hear from you throughout the state. We've had people watching our show across the country. Make sure you drop in, say hello, let us know where you're watching from, and your questions and comments too. Edgar, I do have a question about this, but let's go ahead and let's bring on our guests today. Joining us here on the lunch break, Laura Preston and Iván Carrillo, both members of the ACSA Governmental Relations team, are legislative advocates. They are here with us today to talk a little bit about this. Laura, Iván, good to have you guys on the show. Let me ask for your guys' reaction to that proposal, what you've heard out in the field from our members, from educators. Laura, we'll start with you. What have you been hearing about this, the reaction?
Yeah, I think everybody was, as Edgar mentioned earlier, was a little shocked by the timing of it, why it couldn't wait till this week to come out. I think from what I've been hearing from our members, there's a lot of concern about the plan because you're still going to have to negotiate with your unions to be able to open. And just because there's money's being, incentivized for you doesn't mean you're going to be able to access it, even if you wanted to, because you still have that issue. There's more pressure being put on the unions now than we've seen before to reopen. But it all boils down to that. So there's a number of districts still very concerned about whether they're going to even be able to participate in this program. Remember, it is optional. You don't have to. The other concern I've heard is that many districts, many of you probably on this call, have already implemented your tracing, your vaccination, not your vaccinations, but your testing, your tracing of your of your cases, and the way that this proposal works may or may not, depending on what your district has already put in place, it could counter some of that. So I've heard from a few of our members very concerned that we're not going to be able to do it. It's going to cost us too much money to implement it because we've already created this process that is working for us. So I haven't heard now, and Iván, Edgar, you tell me if you've heard of anybody really excited about the reopening plan or not yet. I haven't heard.
Iván, what are you hearing?
Yeah, so specifically, I've been hearing some comments about the funding distribution method and whether or not this is the best way to distribute the funds based on UPP counts, focusing it on those districts that actually have the means and are able to reopen. There are going to be some winners and losers. And so you're using Prop 98 funding that would normally go out to all LEAs to support all students in this very, in a much narrower fashion. So there have been questions raised around that. Related to the testing cadence that Edgar referenced, there's also legitimate concerns that have been raised related to the cost. When you're testing so frequently, such a significant number of personnel and students, there are costs associated with that. We've been hearing specifically some anecdotes of the cost associated with transporting the test from school sites to the labs. They're significant, and so with higher testing cadence comes higher testing costs. So the workforce issues have come up, and we've been hearing about that prior to the governor's proposed plan. But just in terms of workforce shortages, in terms of inability to find substitutes, even if you want to reopen, if you don't have the workforce to support reopening, that's going to pose some challenges. So there are a number of different legitimate concerns that have been raised thus far, but we'll wait. We're still waiting on details. I mean, it was a broad framework that was released. And the details that will be released later this week will hopefully color in some of these voids that we're currently dealing with.
Naj, I see we had a couple of follow-up questions, which we'll try to touch on there. Lucy asked, how does it affect high schools? Nancy wanted to know how the impact on adult education, and then somebody, I lost track of it.
It was Mary asked about independent learning charter schools.
Got it. So let me try to touch on a few of these in rapid fashion. So good question about the high schools. First of all, it gets a little complicated because the incentive is a requirement that you open up your TK through second grade initially, but that you phase into sixth grade. Now, some of that is that you still get funded for your total ADA. So in other words, they're requiring the earliest grades be the ones that open, but you will get funded for your total student ADA is how that works. So that kind of answers the question in terms of the adult education. It's going to be contingent on what the district's ADA is. Again, the requirements to open are that you're opening up the youngest grades. That Naj mentioned the science that the administration has been touting. They brought on a new expert from the University of California, San Francisco, who's supposed to be one of the leading experts on COVID in schools. And they've been reiterating that the data has shown that bringing back those earlier grades doesn't pose a lot of risk. The last piece I will add to that about, for school, question we get a ton, what about schools that were already reopened? So those can continue to do, you don't have to change anything if you don't want. You can continue on the path you were on. Now, here's the caveat. To be eligible for the funding, for the grants, a district would have to go back and renegotiate their MOU or agreement to bring it up to speed with these new guidelines, namely the new testing guidelines, which obviously has been a source of concern for many of our members, given that some folks have already gone in that direction and they feel like that's cumbersome, right? To go back and have to reopen some of these issues.
Laura and Iván, let me propose these to you, and Iván, you can go ahead and start, because I know you guys have conversations just like Edgar does with other education groups. Gary Reller and Dana Eaton, both asking very similar questions, but we'll do Gary's first. Was CTA involved in developing the governor's plan, and are they on board? Dana asked, are we expecting a formal CTA response to this plan? So I would ask Iván first, have we heard anything as far as our labor partners with their response to this proposal?
Yeah, certainly CTA has been engaged throughout this entire process and consulted. But with that said, they have yet to go as far as supporting the plan. But yeah, without a doubt, CTA will continue to be consulted, because if they oppose the reopening plan that the governor put forth, or whatever it is that the legislature is considering as well, then I think it's safe to assume that it's not going to be successful. So yeah, CTA continues to be a significant stakeholder and primary player in this.
Hey, let me ask one other question. I'm trying to find it here. Patricia Buckmiller. Laura, let me ask you this one, because I think this requires a little clarity here. She asks, from Redlands, you say youngest students. Does this include preschool or just starting at TK? I think it's important for us to provide that kind of clarity when we talk about the range of students here. Are we just talking TK, or are we just going TK down to preschool?
It's not going to preschool. It's TK specific. TK to second grade is where it starts.
Let me switch gears for a second, Naj, and ask Iván. And first of all, we have to welcome Iván. This is his inaugural visit to the legislature.
That's right. It's his maiden voyage here on our show.
We opted against the hazing for today, just Iván, as we've been talking about, this is a part of the bigger budget. Obviously, there's a lot of questions about the reopening plan. The thing that we don't have yet is all the details on the bigger plan. What are we hearing? What do we anticipate? Timing? Just kind of give us what you know on the budget release.
Yeah, so timing, we anticipate that the governor will release his proposal on Friday morning. And so in terms of what to be included in there, and what we know and what we can expect is that the proceedings following his proposal on Friday will move very quickly, that there's going to be pieces of the budget that are going to have urgency clauses that are going to move and through the legislature within the next several weeks. Some of these pieces of the budget are going to require that. If there are pieces to buy down some of the deferrals, that has to happen before these February deferrals take place. If there is pieces related to learning loss, it's well known that LEAs and stakeholders will need time to be able to plan some of these learning loss mitigation strategies. So that's going to move quickly as well. And not to mention what we were just discussing, the reopening pieces. So what we do know is that it's going to be piecemeal. We know that some of these stuff are going to move lightning quick here within the next couple weeks. And we also know that there's some separation between the governor and the legislature. And so in terms of reopening, we already have legislation that's been introduced that I know has been talked about on this platform, AB 10 that's authored by a number of prominent legislators that has a more aggressive reopening approach. We have intent language authored by Assemblywoman Gonzalez, AB 104, related to learning loss. Which is currently intent language, but in conversations with her office, we do know that there will be two portions that are going to be put into that bill here quickly. So learning loss mitigation strategies, expanded learning opportunities for the summer and beyond, as well as potentially a hold harm list for students and their grades. And so we'll see how that differs from the governor's approach and whether or not the governor is supportive of that. But there is significant monies, one-time fashion, that is going to be available to support these initiatives.
Edgar, we got a question in from Scott Smith, the communications leader over at ABC Unified, a loyal viewer of our show, about how this would work with AB 10. Iván just mentioned AB 10, but is there any correlation? Is there any bridge or crossover?
Yeah, this is what we'll be on the lookout for. I think here's the piece on the politics. So as we stated at the beginning, the legislature kind of took the helm, if you will, and put out on the first day that they were sworn in this Assembly Bill 10. And I think that was really a result of some of the frustration they were hearing in their communities. And as we've talked about on the show before, and even heard from them, a lot of them have young kids and seen that in some communities, schools weren't open. So, right. So AB 10 was their proposal on what they're going to do about reopening. And to remind folks, AB 10, the main pillar there is that when a county reaches a particular health metric, when they get out of purple, when they're red, essentially a district would have 2 weeks to start the reopening process. The governor, as we expected, and we had talked about this, that they were going to have their own take on this. This proposal is the governor's take. They are not mandating reopening under certain circumstances. They're still kicking it back to collective bargaining, right? They're trying to use the carrot approach. Let's incentivize districts with money and hope that folks come together on that. As we're hearing from some of our folks, and I'm seeing in some of the chat, some folks have concerns that may not work. So where do we go from all this? I think this is where the legislative process will play out, where the governor can't do anything unilaterally, especially given that he needs legislative approval to get these grants in place. And we talked a little bit about the time frame. They're talking about February 1st deadlines. Frankly, I don't know if that's going to be realistic. A lot has to happen in the legislature, in the process for that to get done. So I do foresee that there's going to have to be some negotiation, some compromise if something is going to get done. What we've told folks is take a breath. Don't worry about those deadlines. Chances are, if you are going to start on this process of working with your stakeholders, that's something you should do. I have to imagine there's going to be some wiggle room on that because I just don't see all this action happening that quickly.
Folks, we told you we were monitoring a couple of stories. Of course, the one over at the U.S. Capitol with what's happening over in D.C. As we mentioned earlier, President-elect Joe Biden has been speaking to that. We are just getting some updated information right now. The news team behind the scenes is working to confirm. But from what I understand, and folks back there, tell me if I'm incorrect on this, NBC, ABC, the Associated Press, all calling now the second Senate race in Georgia for Jon Ossoff. So that is the latest information that we've received right now, is that those three networks, news agencies, have called that race for that second Senate seat in Georgia for Jon Ossoff. So a little bit of additional breaking news for you as we move forward. Laura, I want to go back to that governor's plan really quickly, because we talked earlier about any involvement from labor partners when it comes to this Safe Schools for All plan. I wonder if you could tell me about the impact of collective bargaining at the local level with response to this, because we know, especially in our large urban districts, going back to the table with something like this is not an easy process, correct?
No, it's not. And I know I'm probably singing to the choir for most of our members who are on the call right now. Between the OSHA regulations, the new ones that have just been put out and are still being worked on, that requires us to negotiate our the plan on how you're going to open and reopen, compounded with these other issues. As you know, anything that has to do with the workplace, you're going to need to negotiate. And so it depends on the district, as we know, but we also know that there's been a concerted effort throughout the state by the CTA, the mothership, I call it, the one in Sacramento, to keep schools from reopening until there's a vaccine, or until there's more protocols in place for their teachers' safety. And so many districts who have already started to try to reopen have been getting challenged by their local unions, and there's been several PERB complaints being filed. And so it's not as easy as in the state with the negotiating requirements that we have to do. And especially when until CTA, the statewide association, changes their tune, they're really directing a lot of the local work, and it's true for CSEA as well, but CTA really being the issue that's problematic. And one of the questions that I've seen pop up throughout the chat too is about vaccines, and when are we going to know about the vaccines? And that's still a work in progress. We don't know what they mean by when they say educators are going to get the first, the next round be a priority. Does that mean administrators as well, and classified and all certificated employees? Does it mean everybody, including the central office? So there's a lot of unanswered questions still that we're monitoring it really closely.
Edgar, let me ask you these two questions. Ramiro asks any guidance for high school districts that do not have TK to 2. And then David Miyashiro asks, what constitutes open for in-person learning? Is that 5 days a week with full school days, or will hybrid be considered reopened for in-person learning? What is the clarity on that?
Yeah, that's a good question about the about what constitutes reopening. So they're making it clear. And so the caveat here, which we always have to give, most of the information we have now is derived from our conversations with the administrative officials, us directly talking to them. We got called in over the break, had a few meetings with them. They haven't put details on most of this, and we were hoping to see some of this by the end of the week. Obviously, when the governor releases his budget, we'll hear more of this. We've asked this question about what constitutes reopening, and they're clear that they still believe that their intent is you will still have the flexibility to do a hybrid approach if you're in 5 days a week, whatever that means. The current health and safety guidelines still apply. Namely of that is that they want schools to try to achieve social distancing, right? In many cases, in many communities, the only way you're able to do that is through a hybrid approach. So there would be some flexibility there. I think there'll be more details on, I saw the other question about how long do we have to be open? How will this impact some of the districts that don't have elementary? I think those are the type of things that we're gonna dig into the details. And I know we're gonna plug another avenue we're gonna have later this week to answer some of these questions. And I'm hoping we're going to have more clarity by that time.
Yeah, we are officially across the bottom of the hour here, but the questions keep coming in. Let me just respond really quickly, because Susan Keeler, who's watching us on Facebook, in her comment, in Siskiyou County, vaccines are to be given last week of January for all staff. Susan, if you wouldn't mind just dropping back into the chat, letting us know the extent for all staff, if that means classified administrators, teachers, staff, what that means by all staff, just so we can get that piece of information. And hold on, I'm just trying to, there's a question that I just missed here. Give me a second. Oh, here we go. Yvonne, let me ask you this. Michelle Eklund, who's over at the Placer County Office of Education, one of our loyal viewers, she's been a guest on this show. She's curious about a time frame requirement for remaining open.
Yeah.
What is the information on that?
And Yvonne, you could add on to that. Oh, go ahead, Yvonne. Sorry.
Go ahead, Edgar. It's my understanding that there's not a time frame, but I'll defer to you, Edgar.
Yeah, and I was going to chime in with similar comment that, there's no time frame of how long you have to stay open. In fact, again, going back to the old answer, the understanding is COVID is still going to be around. There's still going to be the need to do this toggle, right? Schools are going to be open. They may have to quarantine. Cohorts may have to quarantine. So I think the intent there is that still is going to happen. I see Angela's question about schools that choose to open under their own guidelines and not these new guidelines. And again, there's still going to be the flexibility to do that. There's not going to be a mandate that you go to the new testing cadence, if you will. The caveat there being that these schools, unfortunately, will not be eligible for the funding. And I think that's the key difference. Now, some of this could change. Again, legislative process. I'm sure there's going to be some concerns about this, but that's where we stand now in terms of the governor's proposal.
And this is why I love our viewers. Susan Keeler puts in something in the chat. We ask Susan Keeler to give us a little bit of additional information. so do our other viewers, and Susan's there for us. So Susan, thank you for passing on that information from Siskiyou County, because I think I do think it's important. Laura, you were talking about vaccines earlier. So let me ask Victor's question about, will staff be required to take the vaccine if and when available? Obviously, we have heard plenty of news stories about roadblocks for the vaccinations taking place, whether it's been getting the vaccine here to California or distributing it. What are we hearing as far as requirements to take the vaccine?
Yeah, this is a question we get asked a lot, and I'm not an attorney, but in working with our HR counsel, there are districts, we're being told that you can make it a condition of employment, that if they're going to come back to work, they have to have the vaccine. Now, having said that, there are some that can't have the vaccine, and or some who have religious objections, and you can't force them to. So you're going to have to find accommodations for them. Either keep them distance, teaching if they're a teacher, or finding other ways to keep them from mingling with the rest of the students and employees. The issue that keeps coming up too, because if you look into these guidelines, it also talks about students and the vaccine. And as you know, we cannot require students to get vaccinated. PTA was able to get language inserted that said you need parental sign-off approval in order to have the student vaccinated. Now, that could change. I mean, one of the things many of you will remember is when we had the measles outbreak a few years ago, and a senator in Sacramento required all students to be to be vaccinated before they would come back to school, and remove many of the exemptions from that. And that was a big fight here in Sacramento. So the only way we're going to get that requirement is if the legislature or Congress enacts that everybody who works at a school site, for example, and the students have to be vaccinated. So there's the two issues. One is the students, and the unions are pushing that they want all the students vaccinated before they can come back, and we don't have the authority to mandate all students be vaccinated. And then the one about employees. And so the law firms are a little bit split on, can you require them to be vaccinated? And my opinion, and listening to enough, is that yes, as a condition of employment.
And folks, if you need somebody who has interactions with a lot of law firms, it's Laura. Laura has interactions with every law firm in the state, it seems like. So
it's because I can't do my job without them.
That's true.
They might give her an honorary membership to the bar there.
Yeah, there you go.
So one more question for me to both of you. It's funny because when we started today, I think the thought was, let's do a little bit of a 2021 forecast and think ahead. But the events of the day, as usually they do, have just kind of taken over, right? It's hard to even think ahead when so much is happening now. But with that said, let me start with you, Laura. So we just got the breaking news that I think it's still considered an upset here that the Democrats are going to control Congress. I know you do some federal work for us in terms of what is that going to mean? What could that potentially mean, especially as it relates to public schools? And then just to top off, final thought from Iván of looking at this context of 2021, aside from what we're seeing here with the budget, COVID is obviously going to be a focus, but kind of what we're seeing on the Sacramento end as we move forward. But we'll start with Laura.
So the short answer is things will be a lot easier for President-elect Biden now that Congress is one party, if you will. Has already come out with a pretty aggressive public education agenda, and he wants to he says fully fund IDEA. Hopefully that could happen. We'll see. But he has some really positive things that he's wanted to roll out. The first being that I think there'll be an extra stimulus bill sooner than later, because the Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans were going to block much more spending. I think with President-elect Biden in place, I think that they will those sort of things will happen much quicker. We will have a president who is for public education. And we fully expect to see many of the Trump, some of the guidelines and rules and executive orders that he has implemented to be reversed. The one that's going to take the most amount of time is trying to figure out Title IX, because it's been adopted in the title. So it's a longer process to undo any of the obstacles that we have seen in the revised Title IX, but that is something that has been raised as well. So I think we feel pretty good, like that, at least the things that the president-elect has been talking about, that will most likely be able to be pushed through.
Iván?
Yeah, no, a couple of things. I think one of the things looking at on the immediate end related to the federal level, and that's important to point out, is that the relief funds that are going to go out, one are going out based on Title I, which means that not every district is going to benefit from it. Whereas last year, there were several pots of federal dollars that went out to schools in different forms. You had governor's discretionary fund, the gear funding, you had COVID relief funds, someone out based on LCFF, someone based on special ed counts. And so the overwhelming majority of the monies are going to go out based on Title I. So that's one thing that's very different when we're looking at the federal pot money this year versus last year. But just kind of just broader topics that I think we can look out for is one, there is significant one-time funds available for this budget year. But we know, and in terms of the forecast we've seen both from finance and others, the LAO, that there's a long-term structural deficit that the state's going to have to deal with. And so that does not bode well for public education. And so while there is an influx of money, and in large part due to the federal funds and some unanticipated revenues for this year, that the state is really going to have to figure out some solutions to the long-term deficit. So there are a number of things that are already being thrown out in terms of examining tax credits that are currently on the books, giving LEAs more flexibility to adopt taxes or levy taxes as well. So we'll see where that goes. Secondly, we'll be watching and engaged very much so on the topic of just racial justice. This is something that's been top of mind post the murder of George Floyd. It's something that ACSA very much has front and center as well in terms of our work. We're engaged in a lot of conversations. School policing is one of the issues that comes up. There's a youth task force that was established through last year's budget within the state superintendent's office that's supposed to be putting forth some recommendations. So that's another area that I think we can certainly expect some activity on, and we'll be engaged and provide updates on that topic as well.
My favorite comment today in the chat comes from our longtime viewer, Angela Shell, who says, fully fund IDEA. What a marvelous concept. Best one of the day, Angela. You get the badge today for the best comment. So thank you for that. Iván Carrillo and Laura Preston from the ACSA Governmental Relations team. Iván, Laura, thank you so much for being with us. Iván, hopefully we didn't scare you too much on this first appearance for the show. So we'll have you guys come back. Thank you guys so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Naj.
Thank you. Let's see. Edgar, on a day where the breaking news just keeps coming in, our news team behind the scenes is working to confirm a story about protesters who are down at the state capitol. They've been there for the last couple of hours, I believe, have now stormed the Capitol. I think that I had heard earlier today that officials at the state capitol had warned lawmakers to not come into the state capitol. But now it appears that some of the protesters that were at the state capitol have now made their way in. It sounds like we are getting confirmation from the NBC station here in Sacramento. Edgar, it's just one of those days.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, we were talking about the U.S. Capitol. The Sacramento Capitol is a place that obviously us at ACSA and our team knows very well. So just I hope everybody in both capitals, on both sides of the country here, just trying to stay safe, and that our authorities are able to get a handle on all of this. I love what one of our members said earlier in the discussion. It's like we almost have to take a moment to take a breath today, because it's just this is a lot. Right. And I think that's the only way we're gonna try to get through all this. So
yeah, I would agree with you. Folks, a couple of programming notes. for you. Coming up tomorrow, ACSA Campus Tour. Victor Tam, the principal over at Edwin and Anita Lee Newcomer School, is going to be our guest. That starts at 10 a.m. Also want to let you know, mark your calendar for two things. One, Edgar, we've been talking about the budget proposal coming out this Friday. And we've got a full day of content for our ACSA members. In the 10 o'clock hour, you can expect to get an email from us. If you're on the ACSA email list, and if you're not, and you're an ACSA member, you should contact our member services department and get that thing figured out. In the 10 o'clock hour, we'll be sending out an email that will have a couple of links to it. One of those links will include a link to our, what we expect will be an 11 a.m. broadcast of the ACSA legislative lunch break. Edgar will be here. I'll be here. ACSA Executive Director Wes Smith will be here to give initial reactions and the top 5 things you need to know about the budget as we have them in that first hour. And then Edgar, for our ACSA members, you and your team do this fantastic piece. Go ahead and take that picture off because we'll go to it again in just a moment. But Edgar, you and your team at 4 o'clock have something really special planned for our members.
Yeah, one of the things that we're lucky here in working and representing our members, we get some briefings. Obviously, we hear what the governor publicly announces. We get to meet with Department of Finance staff, folks in the governor's office, and we kind of have the adage that information is only good if we're able to share it, right? So what we've done the last couple of budget releases is we kind of do an impromptu webinar, knowing that we may not have every answer there, but that even the bits of information that are coming out are useful to our members. So we know it's probably going to be a Friday afternoon, probably better ways to spend it than talking about the state budget, but we know it impacts the work of our members. So we're going to jump online and try to answer as many questions as we can. And as you mentioned, Naj, the information we put out, we'll have the resource on how to register for that webinar.
Yeah, so for our ACSA members, keep an eye on your email in that 10 o'clock hour because we will have an announcement about both of those things. Also want to let all of you know for our show next Wednesday, we have been promised that we will have staff from the governor's office on the show next Wednesday to talk about that Safe School for All plan, maybe some on the budget. So we are telling you now to mark your calendar for next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, as if you've got any place else to be at that time, because the governor's office is making promises to us, Edgar. And the way that I heard you categorize this, we're telling everybody, because if we don't have them here, it's their fault, right?
Yeah. You know what? I guess I just got to be transparent. That we're putting them on the spot, right? So we're expecting them to be here.
I want to give you guys as we close up the show, and thank you folks so much for being with us. I want to give you a way back Wednesday couple of pictures. Michael, if you will pop up that first photo. So this is 1 year ago. This is literally almost 1 year ago. This is what the activity room, the budget war room looked like over in ACSA headquarters. That is the ACSA Governmental Relations team and the ACSA Marketing and Communications team, all there getting the briefing, listening to the governor. That's on budget proposal day. That is not a setup shot. That is legitimately what it looks like. And then, Michael, if you'll pop open the other photo, look at that. That is Edgar and I just moments before we come on the air with our top 5 video. Edgar, I saw these in my iPhone yesterday. I figured I'd pull them up for everybody to see. And look how young you and I look in that photo.
Yeah. The two things that I think about when I see that photo, Naj, is one, I'm wearing a tie, and two, why are you so close to me? But I have to remember that this is pre-COVID, right?
I know, pre-COVID. Who knew? Fermin asks the question, any specific time release for the governor's budget this Friday? Edgar, I will say that we are not necessarily locked into Friday. He may surprise us because we've been surprised before that it may come out tomorrow, but there's normally a time of which this comes, right?
Yes, we're expecting mid-morning, so that could be 10, 11. The governor does like his noon press conferences, so they could take that time frame. So we don't have exact timing yet. I'm assuming we'll get that in the next 24 hours or so. So we're thinking mid to late morning is a safe bet.
All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Remember, we are on with a special edition of the lunch break on Friday around 11 o'clock or so. And then, of course, we're here next Wednesday at 1 o'clock with promised members of the governor's office. Edgar, good to see you today.
Well, it's fun, Naj. Everybody hang in there.
Everybody hang in there. Thank you, folks, so much for being with us today. Have a great rest of the day, a great rest of the week. We'll see you Friday here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break.